In the autumn of 1981, on a hot dust-hazed Saturday morning in late September, a 31-year-old widow named Imelda Cordero stood in the gravel lot behind the Mayhill Produce Market in Otero County, New Mexico, and looked at a pile of ruined fruit the way other people look at a sunrise. The mesa country east of the Sacramento Mountains stretched out behind her, hammered flat under a sky so blue it almost hurt the eyes. The smell of fermented melon hung in the warm air, sweet and faintly alcoholic, the kind of smell that turns most men's stomachs and makes them step back. Imelda did not step back. She stepped closer. Let me tell you who she was. 9 months earlier, her husband, Ruben Cordero, a quiet, dark-eyed man whose family had run goats on the same 80 acres since the 1870s, had been killed when his old paint mare slipped on loose rock during a fence repair and rolled on top of him. He was 34 years old. He died on a Tuesday in January with his hat in the dirt beside him and the wind blowing down off the Sacramentos. She was a town girl. That was what they said about her in Mayhill and at the Mountain States Feed Cooperative in Alamogordo. She had grown up the daughter of a Santa Fe railway mechanic. The community had tolerated her because Ruben loved her. With Ruben gone, the tolerance turned thin. Everyone knew, with the easy certainty of people who do not have to live your life, that Imelda Cordero would not last a year on that place alone. Now here is the thing about that story. The people writing it had never read what Imelda was carrying in the seat of her late husband's pickup that morning. A wooden trunk filled with her mother-in-law's notebooks, 40-some years of them, bound with twine, written in a careful mix of Spanish and English. Imelda had been reading those notebooks every night since June. And what she had found inside them was something the men in the gravel lot would not have believed if she stood up and told them. The pile of melons sat behind the main market building on 4 wooden pallets, stacked 3 layers deep, 400 of them. Honeydews and Crenshaws mostly brought up that summer from the Hondo Valley orchards. There had been a freak hailstorm in early August, and then 3 weeks of unbroken 100-degree sun, and the melons had split inside their skins and caramelized in their own juice. The rinds had gone leathery. The market manager, a heavyset man named Cleve Halsey, was standing beside them in a sweat-stained chambray shirt. It would cost him $80 to pay a hauler to take them to the Otero County landfill. $80 he did not want to spend on garbage. To Cleve Halsey, that pile was a disposal fee. To Imelda Cordero, it was 4 months of winter feed and the future of her late husband's herd. She walked across the gravel toward him in her late mother-in-law's work boots, which were a half size too large. She felt the weight of being watched before she heard the laughter. There were 2 ranchers leaning against a brand new Ford F-250 over by the propane tanks. Wendell Tatum, who ran a large commercial boar goat operation south of Cloudcroft, and his brother-in-law, Royce Penny, who handled the books. They were drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups. The moment her boots hit the gravel, their conversation turned toward her like a weather vane catching a wind. She did not look at them. She had learned in the last 9 months that looking at men like that was a kind of permission you did not have to give. "Mr. Halsey," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "What are you doing with the melons?" Cleve Halsey turned. He took her in. The borrowed boots, the dark braid pulled tight against her skull, the widow's quietness in her face. And he sighed. He was not an unkind man. He was a tired one. "Hauling them to the dump," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Cost me $80. I will give you $15 for the lot," she said. "And I will be back tonight with my husband's truck to take every last one of them off your hands." Cleve Halsey blinked. He looked at her, and then at the pile, and then back at her. He was searching her face for the joke, the way a man feels around a dark room for a light switch he knows must be there. He did not find it. Behind him, the laughter started. Wendell Tatum slapped the side of his new pickup hard enough that the sound carried across the lot. Royce Penny bent at the waist, coffee shaking in his cup. $15, Wendell called out, loud enough for the whole market to hear. $15 for 400 rotten melons. Lord have mercy. The poor woman's gone clean out of her head. His brother-in-law wheezed. The sound was dry and crackling. The sound of men who had already decided what kind of story she was. And that story was a short one, with a sad ending. Imelda did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on Cleve Halsey. Cleve looked at her for a long moment. He saw something in her face. Not foolishness, not desperation, but a flat, settled steadiness, like a stone on a riverbed that the current cannot move. He had seen that look in Ruben Cordero once or twice back when Ruben was alive. He had not understood it then either. "You're serious," he said. "I will need a receipt," she said. The handshake was brief. The receipt was a line scribbled on the back of a feed store flyer. The $15 bill, folded twice, passed from her hand to his. As she walked back across the gravel to her truck, the laughter behind her grew louder, the way laughter does when its targets refuse to turn around. She did not hurry. She walked the way Ruben had walked, the way Esperanza had walked, the way every Cordero who had ever crossed that high desert country had walked, at the pace of a person who has more years of work ahead of her than she has hours in any given day. And that is where I am going to stop the scene for a moment, because what happened next is not what those men thought was happening. They thought they had just watched a grieving town girl throw away $15 on garbage. What they had actually watched was the opening move of a survival strategy 3 generations old, brought back to life by a woman they had already decided was beaten. The desert does not announce its winners. It just lets the next season prove them. But that is not what this story is really about. Not yet. Before we follow Imelda back to the Cordero place, we have to meet the woman who wrote those notebooks. Because every story like this one is really 2 stories. The one the world watches, and the one the world cannot see. The Spanish goat is one of the oldest domestic livestock lineages in North America, brought up from Mexico by Spanish colonial families in the 16 and 1700s. And adapted over centuries to the high desert of New Mexico and the brush country of Texas. Unlike the modern commercial boar goat, the Spanish goat is small, lean, drought-tolerant, and capable of converting low-quality forage into milk and muscle that softer breeds cannot. By the early 1980s, the breed had nearly been bred out of existence by crossbreeding, surviving only in scattered family herds. The Corderos kept one of the last unmixed lines. Part 2. Now let me tell you about Esperanza Cordero, because without her, there is no story. There are no melons, no winter, no goats grazing on the South Mesa in March of 1982, while their neighbors' herds grow gaunt in the corrals to the west. Esperanza was born in 1898, the 3rd daughter of a Cordero family that had been running goats and growing chili peppers on the eastern slope of the Sacramento Mountains, since before New Mexico was a state. Her mother had been a curandera, a healer in the old Spanish colonial sense, a woman who knew which plants brought down a fever and which ones could pull a calf through a winter that should have killed it. Her father had been a quiet man who could not read, but who knew every blade of grass on his 80 acres by name and use. Esperanza inherited both gifts. She kept her first notebook at 11. She married Eulalio Cordero in 1917 at the age of 19 and moved across the valley onto the same 80 acres where Imelda would, 64 years later, decide to buy 400 ruined melons. She lived on that land until she died in 1975 at the age of 77. She buried 2 infants and 1 teenage daughter on the rise behind the house. She raised 3 sons. She doctored her goats and her family, and sometimes her neighbors. She kept the notebooks every year of her adult life. By the time she died, there were 43 of them. Ruben, her youngest, was 28 when she passed. He inherited the herd, the land, and the notebooks. He read them every winter, slowly, by the light of the same kitchen lamp Imelda was reading them by now. Here is what Esperanza believed, written in her own pencil hand in a notebook dated 1934. She believed that the desert was not poor. The desert was particular. It rewarded the people who watched it carefully and punished the people who tried to farm it like Iowa. She believed that nothing the desert grew was waste. Every plant, every animal, every fallen fruit had a use. And the only question worth asking was whether you were patient enough to figure out what that use was. She believed that the conventional advice coming out of the New Mexico State Agricultural Extension Service in the 1930s was a road to debt and a betrayal of everything 400 years of New Mexican ranching had figured out the hard way. And she believed that a Spanish goat, properly fed, could survive a winter that would kill a boar goat or a sheep, as long as the person doing the feeding understood what the animal had been designed by 4 centuries of dry country selection to eat. She had a particular interest in fruit. This is the part you need to remember. In the summer of 1936, the year of the Great Hondo Valley Apple Glut, when there were so many apples in southern New Mexico that the railroad refused to haul them anywhere, Esperanza had watched her neighbors burn pickup loads of fruit in their fields. She had not burned hers. She had spread them, sliced thin, on wooden racks in her family's drying shed, and she had cured them slowly in the cool, dry mesa air over 3 weeks, the way her own mother had cured peaches in the old country. She had fed the dried apples to her goats through the winter of 1936, and she had recorded that the goats gained weight, kept their coats, and gave milk through a winter when the rest of the valley's animals went into the spring hollow, ribbed and sick. She had done it again in 1941 with overripe peaches, in 1949 with haled-out cantaloupes, in 1956 with cull pears from a Capitan orchard. Every time she wrote it down. Every time she recorded the weights, the milk yields, the coat condition, the manure consistency, the overwinter survival rates. By 1963, she had a 40-page section in one notebook dedicated to what she called fruta seca de monte, mountain-dried fruit, as winter feed for Spanish goats. She had figured out which fruits dried best in the high desert air. She had figured out which seeds, when fed whole, produced a mild deworming effect in the gut of a ruminant. She had figured out that the fermented juice and pulp, layered into a compost pile with goat manure and saltbush, broke down over a winter into a black, crumbling humus that could resurrect a piece of overgrazed pasture in a single growing season. It was all there, in pencil, in a wooden trunk, in Imelda's truck. So when Imelda stood in the gravel lot at the Mayhill Market and looked at 400 sun-cracked melons, she was not seeing what Cleve Halsey saw. She was not seeing what Wendell Tatum and Royce Penny saw. She was seeing 4 months of dried, cured melon rind feed, hung in long strips on her late husband's wooden racks. She was seeing seeds saved in glass jars for spring planting. She was seeing a compost pile breaking down over a long, cold winter into the black soil that would feed an abandoned acre by the arroyo. She was seeing her dead husband's herd carried through the worst winter in 15 years on a feed strategy that cost her $15 instead of $900. She was seeing her mother-in-law's pencil handwriting come alive in front of her. After 6 years of silence, the $15 was not a gamble. It was the most informed transaction of her life. And the laughter of Wendell Tatum and Royce Penny was not an insult. It was just the sound the world makes when it does not know what it is looking at. Let me ask you something. Have you ever held a piece of knowledge that nobody around you valued? A skill you learned from somebody who is gone now, that everybody else has forgotten. A way of doing things that the modern world looks at and laughs at? Because if you have, then you understand what was about to happen on the Cordero Place that fall and winter. That night, Imelda backed her late husband's pickup up to the loading area behind the Mayhill Market under the orange buzzing light of a single sodium vapor lamp. She loaded 400 melons by hand, by herself, working until just after 1 in the morning. The work was brutal. Each melon weighed between 10 and 15 pounds. The skins were sticky, her hands cramped, her shoulders burned. She drove home twice, the bed of the Dodge sagging under the weight, the springs creaking on the washboard road up to the mesa. She stacked the melons inside the old adobe and tin drying shed Reuben's grandfather had built in 1922. She fell into bed at 2:30 in the morning, fully clothed, smelling of fermented melon and her own sweat. And she slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who had finally, after 9 months of grieving, done something her dead husband would have recognized as the beginning of a future. Traditional fruit drying for livestock feed in the American Southwest is a practice that predates Anglo-American settlement by more than 2 centuries. Spanish colonial New Mexican families developed sophisticated techniques for preserving summer fruit gluts in the high desert air, where low humidity and intense diurnal temperature swings create ideal natural drying conditions. Dried apples, peaches, pears, and later melon rinds were used both as human food and as supplemental winter feed for goats and sheep. The practice nearly vanished after the Second World War, replaced by commercial feed, and survived into the 1980s only in a few isolated family herds. Part 3. The work began the next morning and did not stop for 19 days. Imelda was up before sunrise. She built a small fire in the wood stove in the kitchen, boiled coffee in the same blue enamel pot her mother-in-law had used for 50 years, and drank it standing at the window watching the first pale gold light come up over the ridge to the east. She had Esperanza's notebook open on the counter beside her, turned to the page dated August of 1949. The page was headed in Spanish, Secado de melones para invierno, drying melons for winter. She had read that page maybe 60 times in the last 3 months. She read it again anyway. There was something steadying about the act of reading the dead woman's handwriting one more time before going out to do the work. Then she went out. The first task was sorting. She walked into the drying shed and set up 3 pallets along the back wall, each labeled with a piece of chalk on a wooden plank. The first pallet she labeled Secado, drying. These were the melons that were still mostly intact, with the firmest rinds. The rind itself, sliced into long thin strips and hung on the wooden racks Ruben's grandfather had built into the rafters, would cure into a chewy, sugar-rich feed the goats would tear into all winter. There were about 240 melons in this category. The second pallet she labeled Semilla, seed. Esperanza had written that the late summer cull melons often produced the strongest seeds, because the fruit had been allowed to ripen fully on the vine. Imelda set aside about 70. The seeds she would harvest carefully, rinse, dry on cheesecloth, and store in glass canning jars in the root cellar. The third pallet she labeled Composta. These had gone too far, already split and weeping fermented juice. They would be wheeled out to the compost pile behind the barn, layered with goat manure and dry saltbush, and left to break down over the winter into the humus that would feed the abandoned acre by the arroyo next spring. There were about 90 in this category. She worked from sunup to sundown for 19 straight days. She sliced the drying grade melons into thin half-inch strips with a worn boning knife she sharpened twice a day on a whetstone Ruben had kept in the kitchen drawer. She hung the strips on the wooden racks. She harvested the seeds, rinsed them, spread them on cheesecloth in the spare bedroom that had been Esperanza's, and labeled each jar with the date and pencil. She wheeled the compost-grade melons out to the pile and covered it with a tarp weighted down with stones. She lost 6 pounds in those 19 days. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles. She slept 4 hours a night. The community noticed. By the second Saturday in October, the story of the Cordero widow and the 400 rotten melons was the running joke at the Mountain States Feed Cooperative and the Cloudcroft Post Office. Wendell Tatum told it with embellishments. Royce Penny laughed at the embellishments. The punchline was always the same. The poor widow had gone soft in the head. She would not last the winter. Imelda heard the talk in pieces, the way you hear a coyote on a far ridge. She did not respond. She had no time. By the second week of November, the drying was complete. 240 melon rinds, sliced into roughly 3,000 long thin strips, hung in golden amber rows from the rafters of the shed, glowing faintly in the late autumn sun like stained glass. She walked into the shed every morning just to look at them. They were already proof, in a way she could not explain even to herself, that she had not lost the thread. The winter came hard that year. The first heavy snow fell on December 11th, a foot of it overnight, blowing in off the Sacramentos in a white howling wall. The temperature dropped to 7 degrees below zero on the night of December 15th and stayed below freezing for the rest of the month. The feed corn shortage that had been building all autumn in the Midwest finally hit the New Mexico market in early January, and the price of commercial goat feed at the Mountain States Cooperative doubled in 2 weeks. Wendell Tatum's boar goats were dropping weight fast. Royce Penny sold off 30 head of yearlings at the Roswell auction at a loss. Imelda's herd of 72 Spanish goats, meanwhile, was thriving. She fed them according to Esperanza's notebook. Half their daily ration was the cured melon rind, taken down from the racks each morning in a wicker basket. A quarter was the family's own stored alfalfa hay. The last quarter was a rough mix of saltbush, dried mesquite pods, and a small handful of cracked corn. The goats took to the cured melon rind with enthusiasm. They lined up at the feeding troughs in the mornings, breath steaming. Their coats stayed thick. The matriarch of the herd, a 15-year-old doe named Paloma who had been Ruben's favorite, gave birth to twin kids on the night of January 7th in temperatures of -4 degrees, and both kids lived and thrived. But it was on the night of January 18th, in the middle of a 3-day blizzard that piled snow up to the windowsills of the old adobe house, that the doubt finally came for her. It came the way doubt always comes, in the small hours, when the body is exhausted and the mind has run out of arguments. She sat at the kitchen table with the propane heater hissing in the corner and the wind hammering the eastern wall. The notebooks open in front of her, the radio crackling about feed corn futures hitting record highs. And for one long hour, she could not remember why she had thought any of this would work. What if Esperanza had just been a stubborn folk healer who happened to be lucky? What if Ruben's gentleness about the old ways had been loyalty, not real conviction? What if the men in the gravel lot had been right? She got up. She pulled on her late husband's heaviest sheepskin coat and her mother-in-law's boots, wrapped a wool scarf twice around her face, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a hand against her chest. She walked the 70 yards to the goat shed, bent forward at the waist against the wind, and she pulled open the heavy plank door. The shed was warm. Warm, in the way a body is warm, with the steady heat of 72 animals breathing together in the dim yellow light of the kerosene lamp. The goats were bedded down in deep, clean straw. Their bellies were round and full of cured melon. Paloma's twin kids were tucked into the warm hollow of their mother's flank. Paloma rose slowly from the straw, walked to her, and pressed her broad, warm forehead into Imelda's hip in the same gesture of recognition she had given Esperanza 40 winters earlier on a different cold night. Imelda stood there for a long time. The doubt did not go away by argument. It went away by evidence. By the time she walked back across the yard through the still howling wind, it was simply gone. And what replaced it was a hard, settled certainty that she carried with her the rest of her life. Cured fruit feed for ruminants depends on a careful balance of sugar content, fiber, and moisture. Dried melon rind, properly cured in low humidity, retains roughly 20 to 25% of its original sugars in a stable form, along with significant amounts of potassium, magnesium, and trace minerals. Goats with their 4-chambered stomachs and slow rumination cycle are particularly well suited to digesting this kind of feed, extracting both energy and hydration from material that would pass through a horse or a cow with much less benefit. Part 4. Spring came late to the Sacramentos that year. Snow held on the north slopes until mid-March. The first green tips of new grass did not push up through the south-facing mesas until the last week of the month. By then, the differences between the herds in Otero County had become impossible to ignore. The commercial boar operations were thin. Wendell Tatum had lost 16 head, mostly to weight loss and cold stress, and another 4 to a respiratory infection that swept through his weakened animals in February. Royce Penny had sold off most of his yearling stock and was scrambling to make payments on a tractor he could no longer afford. Other ranchers had cut their herds back by a third. The Cloudcroft post office that spring was a quiet place. Imelda's herd of 72 Spanish goats had become a herd of 78, with the addition of Paloma's twins and 4 other kids born late in the season. Every animal had come through the winter in solid condition. Imelda walked among them in the mornings with the same calm she had carried since the night in January. On the second Saturday in March, a familiar dust trail appeared on the road coming up from the highway. Imelda was out by the corral, mending a section of fence with baling wire and a pair of fence pliers. She straightened up and watched the dust cloud resolve itself into Cleve Halsey's old red Chevy. He parked at the end of her drive and stood for a long moment looking at her herd grazing on the south mesa in the spring sun. Imelda walked down to meet him. She did not say anything. She just walked to the fence and stood beside him, and they both looked at the goats together. After a while, Cleve spoke without looking at her. "I heard your animals came through the winter," he said. "I heard you didn't lose one." "I didn't lose one," Imelda said. He nodded. He took off his cap and ran his hand through his thinning hair and put it back on. The winter had been hard on him, too. "Folks said you were going to lose the place by spring," he said. "I might have said it, too." "It's all right, Mr. Halsey," she said. "How did you do it?" he asked. He turned and looked her in the face, and there was no humor in his eyes anymore. Just a tired, honest curiosity, the kind a man only finds after he has been wrong about something important. "The melons. Everybody said you were crazy. I thought you were crazy, but you knew something." Imelda thought about that question for a long time. She thought about Esperanza's pencil handwriting in the lamplight. She thought about Ruben's quiet voice explaining what his mother had taught him about the land. She thought about Paloma in the goat shed during the blizzard. "My husband's mother taught me something," she said finally. "She taught me that the desert does not waste anything. Only people do." Cleve Halsey nodded slowly. He looked at the goats. He looked at the dry, pale soil under their hooves that nobody from Iowa would have called farmland. He saw for the first time what Esperanza Cordero had seen 70 years earlier, that this country was not poor, it was particular. "I have a problem," he said after a minute. Every week I throw out maybe $200 worth of produce. Bruised apples, wilted greens, overripe tomatoes. Costs me money to haul it off." He paused. "I want to deliver it to you, once a week. You take whatever you want." Imelda looked at him. Something at the corner of her mouth softened. "I will take all of it," she said. The handshake at her fence that morning was different from the one in the gravel lot in September. It was a handshake between equals. It was also, in a quiet way neither of them named, an apology. Wendell Tatum and Royce Penny never mentioned the Melons to her again. She saw them at the post office in Mayhill, at the feed cooperative in Alamogordo, at the small Catholic church up the road where Reuben was buried. They would nod, faces flat and unreadable, and look away. Once, in the summer of 1983, Wendell Tatum found himself standing behind her in the line at the hardware store in Cloudcroft, and he cleared his throat as if about to say something, then did not. And after a minute simply set his hand lightly on the brim of his hat in her direction. That was the only acknowledgement she ever received. It was enough. The years after that built themselves slowly. Imelda never took out a loan. She expanded the herd carefully, keeping the Spanish line pure. She brought the abandoned acre by the arroyo back to life with the compost from the melon pile. She planted a small fruit patch using the seeds she had saved that first October. Her reputation in the county shifted from the eccentric Cordero widow to Mrs. Cordero, the woman who understood the desert. Younger ranchers drove out to ask her about cover crops and drought feed. She answered every question. She never charged anyone. In the spring of 2019, on a hot, dry afternoon in late April, Imelda, now 69, silver-haired, the calm, quiet eyes still the same, stood on the rise behind the house. The same rise where her late mother-in-law and her late husband were buried, and looked out across the mesa at the herd grazing on the south slope. Her great-niece stood beside her. The girl was 12. She had her great-grandmother's high cheekbones and her great-uncle Reuben's serious dark eyes. Her name was Esperanza. Imelda had brought one of the notebooks up with her, the oldest one, dated 1917. The year Esperanza had married Eulalio and crossed the valley onto this land. She held it out to her great-niece. "This was your great-grandmother's," she said. Her voice was rough from a lifetime of dry desert wind. "There are 43 more in the trunk in the spare bedroom. You will read them, eventually, slowly, the way you read a letter from somebody who loved you." The girl took the notebook carefully in both hands. She looked up at her great-aunt with a question she did not yet know how to ask. Imelda looked out at the herd. "The world is going to tell you," she said, "that some things are worthless. The bruised fruit, the dry pasture, the old ways, the handwriting of women nobody remembers anymore. They will laugh at you for valuing what they have already thrown away." She paused. The wind moved in the piñons. "Let them laugh. The desert remembers. The animals know. And if you listen, really listen, you will know too." The girl, very slowly, opened the notebook to the first page. The pencil handwriting of a 19-year-old bride was still there, faded but legible. The careful loops of a young woman who had not yet known any of what was coming, but had been ready for all of it. The girl ran her fingertip across the first line, the way Imelda had run her fingertip across that same line 40-some years earlier. Imelda watched her. The wind moved in the piñons. The herd moved across the South Mesa. The desert, which had never wasted anything, kept its long, patient counsel. The traditional Spanish colonial New Mexican practice of multi-generational journal keeping by women, particularly women who combined household healing, livestock care, and food preservation, preserved a body of arid land agricultural knowledge that the modern extension service model nearly erased between 1930 and 1980. The handwritten notebooks of women like the fictional Esperanza Cordero exist in real form in archives across northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and West Texas, and have been a quiet but significant resource for the regenerative agriculture and dry land grazing movements of the past 3 decades. The knowledge survived in the margins. It was waiting to be read.